Welcome to Talmud on Monday, March 21st. The weather outside is lovely here in the Mark Goodman Memorial Beit Midrash here at my house.
And it is technically spring.
Lovely. Today is spring.
Although you
the reason I intro that way is because Jeremy also used to open that way because our teacher and friend Rabbi Aaron Alexander used to open his podcast of a halacha yomit by giving a short weather report from the Liner Beit Midrash in beautiful Bel Air, California. Rabbi Alexander no longer works there. He works at Addis Israel in Washington, D.C. And the Liner Beit Midrash is not going to exist much longer because the American Jewish University has sold their campus. So there will be no more weather reports coming from the Liner Beit Midrash near to come. The AJU is going to move their rabbinical school probably down to Pico Robertson. They've disbanded their undergraduate. This is not our Talmud class though, so let's stay focused. Ilanit was poking me earlier that we get a little bit too discursive, which is good. I like discursive. We're going to keep doing discursive and all over the place and tangential.
I never said two.
No, not two.
I didn't say two. I said it was
perfectly discursive. That's right. No, the nature of this class is the nature of this class. That being said, Ilanit, I actually want to stay more on topic, but I generally want when we go into the background of the daf of like how did things operate at the Beit HaMikdash, that I want to do. Talking about how we could better do Purim or what the weather report is in Bel Air is not what I want to do. But okay, I will still tell occasional stories, but we should not spend too much time talking about Israeli ATMs on this Talmud class. We are picking up at on Lamed Amud Aleph, the literal last line. One of those pet peeves of Talmud classes is that you're at the absolute last line of a section of Gemara and you didn't finish and you have to keep going. I'm going to share screen and you will all see where we actually are. If you're doing the daf yourself from Sefaria or you're going to do review later, we are actually, this is not where we are. We are at, we left off at Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, which is the very bottom. So that is in Sefaria, that is Rosh Hashanah .30a.24. All right. And with that, Elisheva, why don't you, so quick review, just so that we remember where we are, since it's been a whole week. We've been arguing about what day it is prohibited to eat chadash, and chadash is the new grain that is to be sacrificed at the temple at the beginning of Passover, and whether that begins on the 16th at dawn or at noon, and whether the prohibition should be all day the 16th, or whether the prohibition really begins on the 17th. So those are a couple possible positions. We've basically moved into the position where we're dealing with, is it prohibited from all day of the 16th or from half of the day on the 16th? And that's where we've kind of left off. Everything else that would be related, the issues of Yashan and Chadash, the issues of when the temple was standing and not when the temple was standing, and the issues of the statements of alternate rabbis are things we have covered in previous classes. And if we were to get back into it, we would not make forward progress. So with that, Elisheva, you're going to read line 24, and we'll have you read also line 1 on 30b, because line 24 does us no good whatsoever by itself. I'll read the Hebrew and Aramaic. Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Beshitat Rebbe Yehuda Amra, de Amar, ad etzem hayom hazeh, ad atzmo shel yom, v'kasavar, ad ve'ad beklal.
Rabbi Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, that is not the reason. Rather, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai stated his decree in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who said, When the verse states, and you shall eat neither bread nor parched corn nor fresh stalks until this self-same day, until you have brought the offering of your God. This does not teach that it is permitted to eat the new grain on the morning of the 16th when the eastern horizon is illuminated. Rather, it is prohibited until the essence, contrasting etzem atzmo, of the day. And he holds that when the verse says, until that day, it means until and including this date. If so, by Torah law, eating the new grain is permitted only after the conclusion of the 16th, unless the Omer offering was sacrificed, in which case it is permitted to eat the new grain immediately after.
Great. All right. So we're arguing about when the day is, and when the day is according to the rabbis. And they are riffing off of a word that they think is superfluous in the Torah text, which they come to assume has some sort of specific understanding of what exactly it is, that it was included in the Torah to serve a specific purpose, that the Torah would not have necessarily used the word etzem hayom hazeh, unless it wanted to differentiate from just not having that and saying ad hayom hazeh, right, on that day. So their interpretation of etzem is that potentially, instead of saying, the morning of you are prohibited, that it's not till the etzem, and I would say etzem in Hebrew is a tough word to translate. Essence is a really good one. Core would be a really good one. That very day itself would be a good translation, right? When you say that something is etzmi, you say it's yours, or atzmo, it belongs to him. But it's the etzem is it's kind of like it's a very possessive word in Hebrew. It's a word that denotes like very strong, much stronger, like belonging and acquisition. So that's why the rabbis are kind of stuck on this concept of atzmo, like the essence of the day. So if it's the essence of the day, there is an argument that the essence of the day doesn't hit until like midday, right? It's not really the day of until midday. And therefore, you might be permitted to continue to eat. You aren't prohibited from eating chadash until the middle of the day, right? And that's kind of the idea that they're playing with. The bigger idea is less about what's prohibited and what makes up the beginning of a halachic day for legally binding purposes. Now, you might say to yourself, oh, but Rabbi, we all know that in Jewish time, the day starts in the evening, right? Mariv, Shacharit, Mincha is the order of prayers, as we learn in Breshit, right? Vayerev vayivoker yom rishon, right? It was evening and it was morning the first day. That Hebrew dates and Hebrew days start in the evening. But Rabbi Goodman would remind you, in Tractate Brachot, we learn that the rabbis, that the Kohanim enter. This is the first Mishnah in Brachot. The Kohanim enter to eat their truma in the evening, even though they are not, if they are ritually impure, they are not actually made pure until the next morning, according to a very long and complicated Gemara in Brachot. They enter, they dunk in the mikvah, they're permitted to eat their truma, but they aren't actually purified until the morning the next day, right? And so there's this whole idea of like actually some of the actionable things in Judaism drop, 6 to 12 hours after the beginning of the day, right? An additional version of this is a confusing aspect to Jewish custom, which is a thing that we modern Jews have to deal with all the time, which is Shiva, right? When does Shiva start? What is day one of Shiva? A logical person, I would think, would say, you bury a person, you go to their funeral, and day one of Shiva is the next day. That is not the case. The case is that Shiva day one begins as long as the burial took place by, midday or the afternoon. You sit for Shiva on day one, the same day as the funeral, and then 7 days later, you get up from Shiva, which would be the same day of the funeral. So you're kind of doing this weird overlappy thing where the day of the funeral and the first day of Shiva are the same day, and that is perfectly permitted. It gets into this issue of etzem hayom hazeh, sort of, right? Which is we have these kind of Jewish ideas of time that are, I wouldn't say non-linear, but they can be simultaneous, right? We can walk and chew gum at the same time in terms of at the same time, in terms of the way we understand time in Judaism. So etzem hayom hazeh can come to mean that even though logically it could be prohibited at the beginning of the day, the reality is it's actually you're actually going to be allowed to do it at the beginning of the day because etzem hayom hazeh doesn't hit until midday. All right, so that's a little bit of where we're going. Hopefully that was somewhat clear. If you're a little bit confused about like the prohibition in the morning and the prohibition midday of eating chadash, that's okay. It's not entirely a clean and clear idea. It's also not relevant for moderns because none of us really deal with this issue of eating chadash in temple times or in post-temple times. So it's the kind of idea where it's fun to play with the idea of halachic simultaneous time, but we don't actually have to lock it down perfectly. All right, with that, someone want to ask something? No. All right, Ilanit, do you mind reading for us line 2?
Yeah, just a second. Okay. In the Aramaic or in the English?
Do you want to do the Aramaic? That would be amazing.
We'll try. All right. Umisavarla kivote the mifaleg plig ale. Wow, this is hard. Alea and dichnan. Misha Charav Beit Hamikdash Hitkin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai Shaya Yom Henef Kulo Asur. Amar Rabbi Yehuda v'halo min haTorah hu asur dichtiv at etzem hayom hazeh.
Well,
the Gemara asks. The Gemara asks, and does Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai hold in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? But he disagrees with him, as we learned in a Mishnah in Sukkah 41a. After the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that for the entire day of waving the Omer offering, eating the grain of the new crop is prohibited. Rabbi Yehuda said, but isn't it prohibited by Torah law as it is written until this self-same day? This indicates that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai.
All right, so we've got a slightly weird little piece here, which is that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has a statement, okay? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's statement implies that because we remember the temple, we prohibit the eating of the chadash on this day. And the reason that's a problem is it seems like that might actually agree with Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda points out that it's what's called midoraita, right? It's a Torah-itic decree that you wouldn't eat that day anyways. And the Torah-itic decree is not interested in this issue of whether the temple is standing or not. So what you have is this very strange little problem that only the rabbis would be interested in, which is Rabban Yochanan Zakkai makes a decree that the Torah already made. So the problem that the Talmud is bringing up is, why are we understanding that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai brought a new law, right? It's like if I were driving down the highway and I saw a highway sign that said, for instance, Paula, you'll appreciate this, 55 miles an hour on the Parkway East, which, by the way, nobody goes 55 miles an hour on Parkway East here in Pittsburgh. I've been knowing this for Paula does. Paula's the lady in the right lane.
Well, I've slowed down because it gets better gas mileage.
Good job. But I think Pennsylvania could solve all of its problems by instituting by actually pulling people over, because everyone's doing 70 at the very least. But anyways, let's say I passed the street, a highway sign that said 55 miles an hour on Parkway East. And I said, ooh, that's a good idea. We should have a speed limit on this highway. And I went to the city council and I said, you know what? We should make a 55 mile an hour speed limit on Parkway East. They would be like, there already is a 55 mile an hour Parkway speed limit on Parkway East, right? You don't need us to put a city council resolution to a vote here. That's the problem that we're dealing with, right? Except it's even more complicated or more hierarchical in the sense that the Torah law should supersede Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. He doesn't need to say this. And if he did say it, it would be not only redundant, but it would be at a lower level. It would be like the city of Pittsburgh declaring that the right of free assembly and free speech and free religion shall not be infringed upon. It's like, yeah, that's in the US Constitution. You don't have the authority to say something. And even if you do, we've already said it at a higher level. That's the problem that we're dealing with. So when that problem happens, and this happens in Torah, we've seen it a couple times in this tractate, they have to figure out, well, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai couldn't possibly have actually meant that, because if the Torah already says it, he must have been doing something else. The interesting thing is this is one of the only times I've learned in Gemara, and because I learned this a number of years ago, I remember this coming up back then, where they don't really satisfactorily solve this problem. So their solution is going to be fairly either interesting, innovative, satisfactory, or not satisfactory. And all of you are going to be like, huh, that was weird. All right, let's get to that exciting conclusion. Paula, why don't you do it? And I will do the Aramaic this time, because I'm assuming your Aramaic is a little rusty. We're on line 3. Hatam Rebbe Yehuda hu deka ta'e. Ihu savar Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai midirabanan ka'amar. Valahi midoraita ka'amar.
The Gemara rejects this argument. There, it was Rabbi Yehuda who erred in his understanding. He thought that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying that eating new grain on the 16th of Nisan is prohibited by rabbinic law, but that is not so. He was actually saying that it is prohibited by Torah law.
Okay, this is an adorable dodge. And it's the thing that I said is probably unsatisfactory, which is the simplest possible answer you could possibly give, which is this isn't Rabban Yochanan pointing at the 55 mile an hour speed limit and going, oh, that's a good idea. Let's go to city council and institute a 55 mile an hour speed limit on this road that already has a 55 mile an hour speed limit. It's him pointing at the sign and saying, oh, there's a 55 mile an hour speed limit here. That's it. That's all he's saying, right? In other words, it's Rabban Yochanan declaring something that we know the Torah already says. Now, the weird thing about that is the Torah already says it. Why would Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai say it again? And the answer is, that's okay. He's actually, Valahi midiraita ka'amar, right? We're just assuming Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai really thought it was worthwhile of reiterating a thing that the Torah said, right? Interesting. I don't know. It's kind of, this is a little bit of the serious nerdery of Talmud, of like really trying to figure out like, why would the Talmud do it this way? Okay. Okay, go ahead, Elisheva, and unmute yourself because I muted you because.
Were there people who weren't doing that, and so he felt it needed to be emphasized? That's usually the reason for repeating laws that are already there.
Yeah, we will never know. I mean, we will never know. It's very hard. I mean, one of the things that was always a challenge for me in rabbinical school is the Talmud talks about, and it's a really great question, Elisheva, because it's a meta question that infuses everything that we do when we approach learning Gemara. One of the biggest challenges of learning an ancient text that has no equivalent parallel is we kind of have to assume that when the rabbis are debating an idea, that's actually the way things were done, right? One of the best laws that are an example of this is the Prose Bowl, right? The Prose Bowl is this legal fiction the rabbis create of a Beit Din in which you could use as a vehicle in order to make loans to people that would not be invalidated by the Shemitah year 7 years later, right? So let's say I'm in year 6 of the Shemitah and Ilanit needs $1,000 for a home equity loan to fix her, leaky plumbing. God forbid, Ilanit, you should ever have leaky plumbing. And Ilanit comes to me and says, Rabbi Goodman, loan me $1,000. And I look at Ilanit and I say, I ain't going to give you $1,000 because next year is the Shemitah year, which means all the loans will be forgiven and you ain't never going to pay me back. So the rabbi's solution to this was the Prose Bowl, right? And the Prose Bowl was, I would give my $1,000 to the rabbis. The rabbis would make me sign a document which invalidated the Shemitah year for that loan. And then they would give that $1,000 to Ilanit. It was this clever legal fiction that allowed for the system of lending and borrowing at interest without forgiveness to work. The question, my long-winded explanation here is, the question that we often have to ask here is that how it really worked? Did Jews actually borrow and lend at interest through a rabbinic intermediary? Or was the Shemitah year just never observed, right? There's a whole thing in the Torah about the Yovel, right? The Jubilee year when all the land remitted to its original owners. There is no evidence by any parallel sources except the Talmud, which isn't a parallel source, it's a related source, that says that Jews actually gave back their land and forgave their debts in the 50th year, right? Like, there is no evidence that the Jubilee ever happened. So what the Talmud says we should do in the law and what actually happens are not necessarily related. My example on Parkway East and drivers is a great example of that, right? It would be erroneous for us to assume that because the state of Pennsylvania put a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on Parkway East, that people actually drive 55 on Parkway East, right? It would be erroneous to believe that every law that's on the books is the way things are. And the Talmud is primarily a law book, right? So the idea that people actually did all these things, we'll never know, right? This one, and Elisheva, you bring it up, this one for me is one of the more weird laws in Torah that I feel was most likely to be disobeyed, right? That the Jews of all of Israel, of Palestine at the time, would arbitrarily look at a pile of grain and say, this that I harvested yesterday is forbidden until some such period, 6 months from now, and at Sukkot, I believe. And this is magically okay for me to eat. That idea I find unlikely. By the way, this is another example by which the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox would also disagree. No Orthodox rabbi would have ever said what I just said, ever. Well, maybe not no Orthodox rabbi, but most, at least modern Orthodox, center Orthodox, and ultra Orthodox rabbis, they predicate their teaching of Talmud on the basic idea that if the Talmud said it, then that's how it was done, right? If it says 55 on Parkway East, everyone drove 55 on Parkway East because God said it. And that's also based on a basic kind of philosophy in Orthodoxy that comes in our Mikorot, in our sources, that earlier generations were more observant, more holy, more religious, whatever. And I think most of us in the progressive Jewish world all know, right, all these things. My wife brings this up, and this is one of my tangents, but it's a good one. My wife's grandmother is from Hungarian Jewish stock. They came over after the Holocaust to Israel in 1964, and they spoke, Hungarian and Romanian, and were from the old country, and they survived, and they were Hasidische. My wife's family is Vishnitz, and they are one of the only houses in Bnei Brak. Everything else in Bnei Brak has been raised for giant, 9 and 12-story apartment buildings. They have this house. When my wife and I would go there would be hundreds of Hasidim who would come to receive my in-laws, because they are kind of Vishnitz royalty. And what my wife would remind us is that her grandmother and her grandfather would occasionally remind everybody that they weren't so frum in the old country, right? That they weren't all Heilige Chassidim and frum Yidden. And it wasn't like it wasn't holier than thou all the time, right? Like, I don't remember exactly what the examples were, but like things like, Noah's grandmother wearing shirts that only came down to her elbows in a B'nai Brak community where the women were, covered head to toe. And nobody was going to tell her grandmother, Ita, that she should cover her elbows because she was legit OG Vishnitz, right? Like they were really connected to the old country. So, and they would occasionally remind people, like, we weren't so frum back in the day. Like it wasn't this strict. Like the rules weren't this. Anyways, that's a slight aside. But the assumption that everything was done according to the Talmud is probably slightly erroneous and possibly completely fictional. All right. That was it was a good question, Elishev. I'm sorry the answer was so long. Good. Let's keep last line. Was that?
I said it's a good answer.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think one of the weird things is there just aren't that many conservative rabbis teaching Gemara anymore. So, and Elanit and I were having a conversation last night about kind of like really high level Gemara learning. And really high level Gemara learning is really, really great. And it's very, very rare outside of rabbinical school and the Orthodox community. And the other thing I was saying was Elanit would have been a great Talmudist, except the career paths for, I hope it's okay that I say this, Elanit. I'm only saying what I said anyways. The career paths for, PhD level women Talmudists is exceedingly narrow, right? You can get a university job in a handful of places, or you can from out and your Talmud learning is only allowed in basically the Hartman Institute, the Drisha Institute, and Hadar. Those are your options in the world. I can name them, and Svara in Chicago if you want to teach queer Talmud. But it's a short list, right? It's a little strange that I can name all of the women's Talmud institutes in the world. I'm sure there are 3 or 4 more, but there aren't many, and that's a bummer because women should teach Talmud. All right, let's do line 4. D, you may be baking, or cooking, or cleaning, or hanging out, or sleeping. Or do you want to read D? D is not there. All right, Elisheva, you're going to read 4. I will read the Aramaic. Vaha hitkin katani. My hitkin, darash v'hitkin. Unmute first.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
The Gemara raises a difficulty, but it is taught in the Mishnah, instituted. This term is referring to a rabbinic ordinance, not a Torah law. The Gemara explains. What is the meaning of the term instituted? It means that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai interpreted the verse and instituted that this is how one should act from now onward. When the temple was standing, there was no need for this halakha, as it was permitted to eat the new grain after the sacrificing of the Omer.
Okay, this is a pretty good resolution to our problem. And the reality is that they're doing a move that is actually going to have great significance moving forward, which is the word hitkin. Okay, so there are, if you opened up an Art Scroll prayer book, you'd find, and I think it's also, I take it back, it's in Sim Shalom also. In the morning prayers, there's a section of study that we do before we get to Psuki de Zimra after Bir Kodesh, at the tail end of Bir Kodesh Shachar. And one of the traditional things that we study is the 13 exegetical principles of Rabbi Eliezer. And there are certain rules for how a bill becomes a law in Judaism, for lack of a better term. And one of the most radical of how a bill becomes a law, or how the rabbinic world decides something, is rather than interpret it out of Talmudic text, they will issue a decree. A decree is the most radical form of rabbinic exegesis that you can do. It's basically an external decree that either supersedes or retrofits on top of, or can even nullify an idea from the Torah. And it's also referred to as a takana. So hitkin and takana are the same word. Takanot are really, really rare. I'll give you the most important example in Jewish legal history. And it's actually now that I'm talking about it, I'm really interested in the note that's in my side page. The note that's in the side page of my Gemara says, a takana, which supersedes a kra, dash, applicable to homosexuality. I wrote that in 2003, okay? And the reason that's interesting is because the conservative movement considered a takana to the law in the Torah around prohibiting male homosexuality in 2006. I forget which rabbi brought it. I want to say Rabbi Fine, but not Lawrence Fine. Maybe Lawrence Fine. I don't remember. Anyways, a rabbi by the name of Fine. David Fine? Anyways, there was a rabbi who brought forth a takana when the conservative movement in 2005 and 6 was wrestling with the question of how to permit openly gay rabbis and permit potentially gay and lesbian marriage and kind of normalize homosexuality, right? The problem is the Torah forbids homosexuality, right? A man shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It is an abomination, straight out of Leviticus, right? So how do you get around that? Well, a takana is one legal way of doing it, but a takana is a power move, right? It is a big, big move. It is basically the the constitutional amendment of Jewish law, right? It's a big, big move. And so when Rabbi Fine's tshuva reached the law committee, they rejected it because he tried to do a takana, and they decided not to do that. What they instead did was they got three rabbis together, Dorf, Nevins, and Reisner, who each wrote their own tshuvot. They combined their three tshuvot into one, and their tshuva did what was called a mute, right? A limiting law. And they basically limited the application of a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman, it is an abomination, to the smallest possible way you could ever interpret it, which is problematic and troubling for me. What they did, if you're interested, to go back a number of years, is in their 72-page tshuva, which is a brilliant work and is wonderful to study. They effectively said, and this was really interesting because Rabbi Dorf is the most old school cis het white male you've ever met, right? But Rabbi Dorf in the 90s sat down with gay men and asked all sorts of specific questions about how they had sex with each other. And he was of the assumption that it was, pardon me for getting very graphic on this Monday morning, but it was men engaged in penile anal penetration as their main mode of sexual gratification. And what a number of gay men that Rabbi Dorf talked to told him, that's not so, right? That's not the way gay men engage in sex. And so what the Dorf, Nevins, Reiser tshuva would eventually decide is it would not make a takana. What it would say was gay men could express their love for each other all sorts of ways, except one, because the one that the Torah forbids, a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman, is an abomination. So they kept that law on the books because they did not want to abrogate a law of Torah. That is what this verse is doing, Rosh Hashanah 30b-4, which is pointing out that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did a takana here, right? When the temple was standing, there was no need for this halacha, as it was permitted to eat the new grain after the sacrificing of the Omer. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is issuing a takana. Now, the reason the conservative movement rabbis were uncomfortable with a takana is it is a power move, and it is a power move that the rabbi who recreated rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the temple, he did a bunch. But he needed to because there was no temple standing, right? It was exigent circumstances to keep the religion alive. And Dorf, Nevins, and Reisner did not think that a takana was necessary to mess with things. A takana and another principle of exegetical I was going to say exegetical exegesis, but that's not, you can't say that, was another one. It's a principle called oker davar min haTorah, uproot a thing from the Torah, which I actually can't think of a single instance of something that's oker davar min haTorah. Is there a single line in Torah? Ooh, Elanit's got one. Elanit, do you know what's oker davar min haTorah? Is there anything that's
No,
uprooted?
I was going to add, no, finish what you're saying. I was going to add something else.
Oh,
I don't.
So like somebody might say Ben Sorer or Moreh, the stubborn and rebellious child who gets stoned at the temple, at the city gate, would be maybe like that, but it's not, because the rabbis actually read it out of existence by saying it never really happened. We're literally talking about like theoretically taking a line in the Torah and striking a line through it and saying we don't do this anymore, right? Or this is not to be done at any time in the future. We just don't believe this anymore. And I just can't think of it's an exegetical principle that exists. And as far as I know, it's not practicable. So this is another kind of move. So when I say this is a really interesting line in the Talmud, it's a really interesting line because we're dealing with the entire principle of like when you're allowed to change laws in Torah and Talmud and how it goes about and how radical you're allowed to be when you do it. And my point was, you don't need to do a takana. You can be clever and get to your ultimate conclusion without a takana. I, as a conservative rabbi who's on the left of the homosexuality debate, would have preferred the takana or the oker davar min haTorah line about homosexuality. All right, Eleni, go ahead.
So this is, again, continuing to get off our topic, but farther from the idea of a takana. But, you know, we do, rather than strike things from the Torah, we do have a long history of reinterpreting things. And one thing that and again, this is not really on topic anymore, but one thing that I have seen in this discourse is going back to the context of saying, oh no, we have this Torah, and it really looks like you say that homosexuality is forbidden. A man should not lie with a man the way that lies with a woman. What I have seen in the discourse is this being a line about dominance, and that, you know, in this time, you know, when a man had sex with a woman, he was in a kind of a dominant position and she had very little power in that. And this being a line about men should not be able to dominate other men in the same way. Mm-hmm. And to be able to, and this is done all the time in the Talmud, where you have something that seems problematic and you reinterpret it's like, oh, it's actually referring to this case and this case and this case. To not say, oh, we have a really problematic line, we need to get rid of it, or rather to reinterpret it and say that sex requires consent. That's what this line is referring to.
Great. I'll call on you a second, Elisheva. I want to tell you something that you may or may not know, because I learned it in school from the horse's mouth, which was in 1989, 87, 88, something like that, when Rabbi Brad Artson was a pulpit rabbi. He submitted a tshuva to the law committee based on some studies that he had done from ancient Near East PhDs that implied that his tshuva was, man shall not lie with a man as with a woman, it is an abomination, was a common practice in Roman times, in which, in order to humiliate the enemy, when armies would conquer other armies and enslave them, the men would rape the other men in the army. Okay. And so his interpretation in this tshuva was, the Torah was talking about male-male rape. We're not talking about male-male rape in modern times. And therefore, modern consensual, it's to your point, Eleni, modern consensual homosexuality is not forbidden d'oraita, right? The law committee didn't take it, didn't vote for it. It was rejected. And therefore, all rejected tshuva are not published, which is why you're never going to see my tshuva in publication. The other thing that encouraged me to write my tshuva was the knowledge that if Brad Artson can write a tshuva that they would not that they would vote against, then damn it, I can do it too, right? The piece that undid it, and Brad doesn't even support that own tshuva today, is that scholars really debate that point very strongly. There's not a lot of, that's only like one or two couple PhDs who wrote a couple papers who said, oh, this is what it meant. And there were a whole bunch of other PhDs who came in the last 20 or 30 years and said, no, it doesn't mean that, right? Male-male homosexuality was not just considered forcible. But like now we're just arguing about what PhDs say and how we want to use them in order to make our interpretations of how to solemnify and dignify, consensual loving relations between same-sex individuals. All right, Elisheva, go ahead.
Just the best reinterpretation or interpretation of this I have seen, I can give you the citation, I have to look it up, I don't remember the author, is based on the word toeva, which we don't really know what it means.
Right.
We know it's something bad. It is 99% of the time used about pagan temple worship practices. And the interpretation is that this is referring to a pagan temple practice of male-male prostitution in the temple. And that's what's prohibited, not relationships between people.
Yep. Yeah, we learned that in school too, that toeva was about the cultic rites of sex. That's also hotly debated as to whether, one of the words that's also in there that shows up in Torah is the term kadeshah, right? That there was a temple priestess in other religions. And the word kadeshah is from the word holy, but it is in the Torah, when it appears, it is a synonym with prostitute. So the phrase that you'll see in some of the more scholarly works is cultic prostitute, that apparently in the old days in some religions, you would go to the temple, you would make an offering, you would have sex with the temple prostitute, and then she would prophesy your future, which that's a very different type of Shabbat morning service than I would have ever expected or been used to, right? But, and also a very different use of synagogue dues. Okay, moving on before I get into big trouble.
Although it's interesting that I have always thought the talk about Pinchas driving the spear through the two having sex in the temple particularly suggests that indeed that was a pagan practice.
Yeah. There's also a read that says that there's the phrase in that parsha says lifnei ohel moed, and instead of one of the interpretations I once read is that they weren't having sex in front of the ohel moed, they were having sex. Lifnei in this context might have meant on the mizbeach. They were having sex on the altar at the ohel moed, which I always quite like as a crazy idea.
But the point is, if pagans were using sex as part of their cultic ritual, it's not such a stretch. The issue was that she was a pagan.
Yes. All of this still lives, again, back to Rabbi Artzen's tshuva, in the world of conjecture. And it goes back to your question, Elisheva, which is when the Torah doesn't really suss out what people actually did, it leaves us to either assume that the rabbis were telling us exactly what happened, or to try and fill in the gaps of like, all right, well, the rabbis say this is the way it should be done, but was it actually done that way? All right, with that, we're going to keep moving. We're going to do the Mishnah. I don't think we're going to finish. We're going to get into the Gemara. We're probably just going to wrestle with the Mishnah. And there are a lot of places where the Mishnah, spoiler alert or warning, where the Mishnah is not real clear about what it's talking about. And if you're going to ask a question, my answer is probably going to be, that's a good question. I think the Gemara is going to answer that. I sure hope so, right? And if the Gemara doesn't answer it, we'll never know, because, but they're actually going back into an issue we covered like last parak, 2 paraks ago, which is the issue of witnessing the new moon. But the way they're going to be going in a second is the purpose back there when we read it a couple months ago, years ago, we were talking about how many witnesses you needed to call and when and how for the new moon. And it was that whole issue of, the pagans lighting bonfires. So they instituted a second day of Rosh Chodesh and a second day of holidays in the diaspora, right? That whole idea. That is not exactly the case, because here we're going to be talking only about witnessing the new moon for Rosh Hashanah. And then the question of why do we have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah? Spoiler alert, for those who don't already otherwise know, we do 2 days of Rosh Hashanah even in Israel. It is not a diaspora-based idea. We will touch upon that as we get into things a little bit later. The short answer for now is the rabbis eventually decide, I think somewhere on page like 34, that Rosh Hashanah is actually called Yama Arechta. It's actually just one long 48-hour day. Getting back into the rabbis saying absurd things that we're just supposed to just accept because that's what they say. So, all right, let's keep going. We're going to do the Mishnah. Paula, will you read this for us? Matnitin, our Mishnah. Barishona hayu mekablin edut hachodesh kol hayom.
Mishnah. Initially, they would accept testimony to determine the start of the month throughout the entire 30th day, from the beginning of the month of Elul before Rosh Hashanah. And if witnesses arrived from afar and testified that they had sighted the new moon the previous night, they would declare the day a festival.
All right. So we're doing this whole thing about we're getting into witnesses that would come to declare the new moon, which would tell us when Rosh Hashanah was going to start. All right. Paul, why don't you read the next one since that was kind of short? Pam achad nishtahu ha'edim milavo v'nit kalkalu haleviim bashir hitkinu shelo yihiu mekablin ele ad hamincha.
Once the witnesses tarried coming until the hour was late, and the Levites erred with regard to the song, i.e. the psalm that they were supposed to recite, as they did not know at the time whether it was festival or an ordinary weekday. From that point on, the sages instituted that they would only accept testimony to determine the start of the month only until mincha time. If witnesses had not arrived by that hour, they would declare Elul a 30-day month and calculate the dates of the festivals accordingly.
Okay, so we're dealing with the issue of intercalating the calendar, which again goes back to the era when Jeremy Marquise was teaching this class way back in the first parak, right? And how the rabbis would decide. I mean, Elon is so long ago that Elonite was still in elementary school when this took, no, just kidding. Elonite was at least still living in New York City when this was taking place. So it's a long time ago, but we're dealing with the issue of how the witnesses had to testify about whether they saw the new moon in order for the rabbis to decide whether it was going to be a 29 or a 30-day month, right? And so the rabbis would decide about, it's crazy that it worked this way, but like the way the calendar worked before we standardized the calendar in Judaism on this 19-year cycle in which certain years had certain number of dates at certain times and certain months were 29 days versus 30 days, right? The rabbis would actually just do it on the fly every single year based on how the lunar calendar was lining up with the solar calendar. And if it didn't line up properly, they would add a day to the month, right? And that is pretty wild, but that's how they did things. And so and in order to do that, they determined that they had to set a time limit by which the witnesses were permitted to come. So it's actually related to the last thing about Etzem Hayom Hazeh slightly, which is interesting because that was a Gemara and this is a Mishnah. So it might just be coincidental, or the rabbis might have been instituting that Gemara there because they knew what was coming next and they wanted to talk about this. Nonetheless, there's this interesting moment where they say the Levites erred with regard to the song, meaning they picked the psalm for Sunday when it should have been the psalm for Saturday, right? Or the psalm for Yontiv, right? I have this additional problem at Beth Shalom, which I learned halfway in. At Beth Shalom, we do this really strange thing when it's too dark to say mincha anymore. We say this weird kind of, I call it the hecher mincha, which is like a sort of mincha that's not really mincha. We don't do Amidah because it's too late to do Amidah. Even though halachically, I know reasons why you might be allowed to do Amidah there. What we do is we read Ashrei, we say a psalm of healing, then we recite a couple of prayers. I actually don't recite those prayers. Paula knows I give a Dvar Torah there, which Rabbi Adelson still is irritated by, but sometimes I just do things my way, and I know that it irritates him. And that's just how it is. Paul is all about me irritating the senior rabbi. I am the pea in his mattress sometimes, but I'm a beautiful and wonderful pea. And then we do the Psalm of the day. And when I started doing this, I've been leading either Wednesday or Sunday mincha, mincha mariv, since the pandemic began. So it's like 2.5 years now, or two years now. When we started doing it, I would do the Psalm for the day for mincha, which is, if it's Wednesday, then I would do the Psalm for Wednesday. And after like 6 months or a year of doing this, I returned to me and said, you're supposed to do the one for Thursday. And I was like, what? And he goes, yeah, the mincha one goes into the next day. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. And he's like, but that's how we do it. And I was like, oh, okay. And I started doing the one for Thursday. And that's just what I did, because Ira said so, right? So never believe that I don't listen to congregational tradition. If Ira says to do it, then I do it. Paula, go ahead.
Doesn't have to match the Yortzeit list for the next day.
It doesn't, I mean, the whole
The list of it starts that night, and the people that have to say Kaddish that night and the following day, and your psalm has to match.
I mean, you make a logical principle, but this whole institution of Hecher Mincha is totally made up, and all of the aspects of it are totally made up. So there's no.
Rabbi,
Don't tell Ira I did anything logical, please.
Go ahead, Dee.
you were correct, because it would be part of the Mincha service, which was the day before, not the coming day. So it was, if it's a Wednesday night that you're doing it, you're doing the Mincha for Wednesday night, not Thursday morning. So you were correct.
There's
Maybe we need to do both.
Yes,
But he's talking about a time that it's too late to actually do mincha, which means that it's not actually Wednesday anymore.
which is why you do
Exactly.
Thursday. Go ahead, Dee. You were gonna say something?
She's not there. She never is in shul. She needs to stay out of it and go bake something.
No, I like
You're
this.
saying the Yortzeit for the people for the Wednesday, not for Thursday.
Right.
So
But Elanit's point is you can't say the psalm for Wednesday anymore because it's not Wednesday, it's Thursday. But the problem, of course, that you're announcing is, but we're pretending like it's mincha for Wednesday. So I think you're both right to be some, and by the way, because this whole ceremony is kind of made up, that's why I kind of go, okay. And that's also why I give a Dvar Torah instead of saying the prayer for Israel and the prayer for our country, because that's also made up. So my Dvar Torah is just as made up as the decision to say these things, right? But, like intelligent people can differ. Anyways, I thought that was really interesting, this issue of Beth Shalom is not the first congregation in the world to have a problem with figuring out which psalm we say based on where we are in Mincha, right? The Levites had this problem going back 2,000 years. So Dee and Elanich, your problem and your disagreement is well-founded. Let's do one more line so we can say we did one more line. Actually, if we do 2 more lines, we finish the Mishnah, and then we can kind of get into them for next time. All right, I'll do these since we're over by a minute. V'im bao edim min hamincha u lemala nohagin oto hayom kodesh umachar kodesh. If the witnesses came from mincha onward, although the calculations for the dates of the festivals would begin from the following day, the people would nevertheless observe that day on which the witnesses arrived as sacred. And so in future years, they would not treat the entire day as a weekday and engage in labor from the morning on the assumption that the witnesses will arrive only after mincha time. And they would also observe the following day as sacred. On the second day, they observed Rosh Hashanah in full, both by sacrificing its offerings, as well as by calculating the upcoming festivals from that date. So basically, this is one of the reasons why we have a 2-day Rosh Hashanah, because sometimes the witnesses would arrive after Mincha. We will get more into this into the Gemara. Mi shechara bet hamikdash hikin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai sheyu mekablin edut hachodesh kol hayom. After the temple was destroyed and there was no longer any reason for this ordinance, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that they would once again accept testimony to determine the start of the month the entire day. So Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai basically says, we're not worried about Mincha anymore. It can go all the way to Mariv. You're fine, right? And that's only because the temple was destroyed. And again, we once again have a takana, right? A hitkin thrown in here, which relates to our last thing, which is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai issuing decrees after the destruction of the temple, which is our running theme at this back end of the book of Rosh Hashanah. We are seeing over and over again the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai feels the need to kind of addend, constitutional amendments now that the Torah has been, the temple has been destroyed, so that Judaism continues to thrive. All right, that's our class for today. We will pick it up next week. I think maybe starting next week, or might be the week after, will be the beginning of us ending class with me staring into a Zoom and mumbling a lot of Aramaic and Hebrew really, really fast. I thought we were going to go, I knew we were going to go slow and I'd have a lot to do. I did not know we were going to go this slow because I have a lot of mumbling to do, and that is okay, because the mumbling is only there so that we can observe the ability for firstborns to get not have to fast on the day before Pesach when we're all too busy burning things and cleaning things or cooking things. All right. I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their Monday morning.